emails from Brene. There's opportunities for you to sign up for blocks of time to meet with the speakers individually as well. There's a lot. So feel free to take advantage of that. Today, I won't spend any more time collaborating. This is Dr. Elizabeth Bradley. She joined Clemson here in April of this year. So pretty new, but she's been doing a lot of work, some of which I think she'll talk about today. She's an extension wildlife damage specialist and also an extension assistant professor here at Clemson. She got her bachelor's of science degree from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, a PhD in earth sciences from Auburn University, where she studied the impacts of wild pigs on water quality and pathogen transmission. After graduating, she worked on a joint team with the Gates Foundation and NASA to investigate ways to mitigate malaria globally. And she broadly defines herself as a disturbance ecologist with interests in the cascading effects of disturbances on ecosystem processes, particularly as it relates to agricultural production, function, and disease ecology. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth and let her start talking about the research.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, especially doing a graduate seminar. This is my graduate research, so you get really fond of it, but it does take a year after, because I didn't want to think about things at all for an entire year. But I'm sure you'll be able to understand. So yeah, the basis of my project, as you can see from the title, is that it was the impacts of invasive wild pigs in the Southeastern coastal plain. So there's some caveats we need to give quickly before we get going, which is today we're talking about the world's most prolific mammal, or one of the most prolific mammalian species. And I believe that they're located in 52 countries outside of their native range, which is pretty impressive because there's 81 in their native range. So we've really taken them everywhere. And they're a huge issue, basically everywhere they're not supposed to be, including here. And there's a lot of people in North America and abroad that will really get into the weeds of distinctions between Sus scrofa, which is, as we know, like the wild pigs, and Sus scrofa domesticus. In North America, it doesn't matter. We're not getting into the weeds of any of that because they're all hybrids. We've got the worst of them. So we have all the hardiness of the Eurasian boar and the reproductive capacity of domestic swine. You'll see headlines frequently about things called like Hogzilla. That's just a domestic animal that's gotten loose, maybe one generation removed from domestic livestock. So just a caveat there. And before we go on, also a little bit of context here is they arrived on board the ship of Hernando de Soto, is one of the earliest documented examples of a sounder that was observed naturalized in the ecosystem. And I say naturalized loosely because I do believe they're invasive, but you understand what I'm talking about. Essentially, they landed, they lost some on their trek up through the Northeast in Florida, and on their return to go back and not fly, that would be more convenient, but across the ocean again, they discovered some with notches in their ear, which was how they discovered that Native Americans had begun to essentially farm them. And they basically stayed in Florida for the next 400 years until around the 1980s. Somebody at some hunting magazine really got behind the idea that this was going to be North America's next big game species. And suddenly pigs that could only move maybe a few hundred kilometers in their lifetime suddenly moved 70 miles per hour down the interstate. So we've had almost exponential growth since then, and they're present through most of the country, like Southeast especially. And unfortunately, by the end of this year, it's anticipated that they'll occupy 91% of all the Southeast. So like I just mentioned, they're throughout the Southeast. That's because we couldn't come up with better habitat for them. They need three things, which is cover, food, and water. They can't thermoregulate, so they spend the vast majority of their time in and around water. This is one of their biggest impacts because their fecal contribution to the ecosystem originates through that. It's how they directly pollute water and introduce all these nutrients to systems where it may or may not be present. The other obvious impact is their predation. They're extremely opportunistic omnivores. And so there's a great study, if you really want to get in the weeds of it, where they cut open a pig and found like something like 3 dozen eastern spadeboot toads, which if you know anything about herpetology, that's probably an entire breeding population that it just stumbled across and ate every one of them. So, you know, this is probably indicative, or at least gives you like an idea of how they're imperiling 672 different taxa. Another well-known disturbance they have is their rooting and wallowing behavior. It's where they turn the soil over with their noses, and the rolling around that they do in their wallows. This has a vast number of ways that this can disrupt soil ecology and different nutrient dynamics and that kind of thing. And then, of course, the last one takes us back, of course, to the fecal contamination. 87% of all diseases identified in pigs at large are zoonotic in nature. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those are zoonotic to us and livestock. So it's pretty easy to quickly see how that could be an issue, especially given that 77% of US agricultural animals are co-occurring in counties where wild pigs are located. So there's a real direct zoonotic risk there. And they're also alongside 47% of rural Americans. So when you think about the capacity to spread zoonotic disease, it's quite significant. So before we get going into my favorite part of my research, I'm going to tell you a little bit of research I did kind of at the start at Auburn, which is finishing up a prior study done by Sarah Bold out of Auburn. And in this study, it's at a privately owned large tract of land that's managed for game species. And they have truly extraordinary pig problems there. And it's no fault of this landowner. He's just got a neighbor who's wild about pigs. And so high density for wild pigs is about 8 per square kilometer. This property had 16 per square kilometer. And when other grad students, including Matt McDonough, went out and were estimating the population and how many would need to be removed by grad students and also the USDA, they wound up killing like 879 pigs, and that was 125% of their original estimates. There was no end in sight. So we know that when you apply that pressure to them, you can reduce the E. coli in headwater streams. And for context, headwater is the start of a river system. And so that was where I was most interested in looking. This is where Sarah was most interested in looking, because when you're there, you can truly isolate whether what you're measuring is related to pigs or not, as opposed to additional inputs. And what they found was a 75% reduction. And I asked a question one day, which is, by the way, is a great way to get looped into doing more work. So careful asking questions. What happens afterwards? And the answer was, we don't really know. We would expect that it would rebound, it would come back eventually. The hope is that there would be like a longer period without it returning to pre-removal status. What I found was, no, it came back almost immediately, and quite alarmingly, actually. So E. coli levels increased 746% in the year following the conclusion of removal events. This means there were no longer trapping, and there was only sporadic shooting, but insignificant on the scale, because for context, you have to kill something like 70 to 75% of a wild pig population to hold the population steady at the density it's currently at. You have to do more than that every single year to decrease population. But it decreased 746%. That represents about 79% greater than pre-removal levels. That tells you not only are these populations coming back, it's coming back in a big way, and in a way that's large enough that just the ambient fecal contamination they're doing from spending their time in and around watersheds was able to contribute. The fecal coliform is another method that we use in the United States for measuring water quality, especially as it pertains to disease risk. And that increased 567%, which is 159% greater than free removal. And more alarmingly, in my personal opinion, is that 64% of the samples exceeded EPA recommendations for recreational use of surface waters. This is what you should consider before you hop in creeks in the Southeast. Always check your state and find out if this is a listed stretch of river. Because this is essentially the limit for what is a reasonable exposure to pathogens. I think we've all heard about the fun that happened in Paris last summer. And for context, their limits are double ours. So what we view as being clean water, it's a little bit different than they view in the EU. So just some context here as well. This 60% increase is also representing like a 10% increase from pre-removal levels. So your 10% on any given day that you get into that water, you got a 10% higher odds that you will get sick with some kind of gastroenteric illness, which is a very polite way of saying a diarrheal disease. So now we get to talk about what I'm most passionate about, which is my involvement with the Alabama Feral Swine Eradication and Control Pilot Program. This was a partnership between the USDA, APHIS, USDA, NRCS, Soil and Water Conservation Committees, and universities. Took place in a multitude of states, and I had the privilege of getting to represent Alabama and Auburn. So this was divided into two regions. We followed, essentially, we followed federal recommendations, which was they're going out and they were going to kill pigs in different regions of the state. So we subdivided our results into different states as well. The important things to think about for context at the start of this work was we had no idea if you'd be able to detect pig presence at scale. And what I mean by that is outside of a place like that tract of timberland, can you, like in a normal, maybe 8 pigs per square kilometer type density, could you detect them in winter? Think about fecal contamination as kind of ambient. It moves around because these populations are moving around. Would you even be able to find evidence that pigs were there? Another unknown is that fecal contamination enough to alter water chemistry? That was a big component of it. And if you are able to detect pigs in streams and you can link that, their presence to the E. coli levels, are they doing anything to the safety of that water? Are they increasing the E. coli levels? And so those are my 3 objectives. Obviously, I just told them to you in a kind of circuitous way. But there were a lot of unknowns. We just didn't know what we could do at scale. Each one of my study sites were between 2.5 to 4.5 hours away one way. For context, we really were getting quite the spread. It doesn't look like it from this map, or it looks like they're all overlapping, but these are miles and miles apart, these watersheds. Most of them, actually all of them, aren't touching in any way. So these are all distinct headwaters, but importantly, they are all within the same realm of classification for the National Wetland Inventory. So they're the same type of wetland, which is a polystrine forested wetland. If you want to get into the weeds of those kind of details, please talk to me later. I'd love to get into the nuts and bolts of it. The study design of it, we took an exhaustive period of time driving around. We want to make sure there were no human pollutants. We want to make sure there's no leaking septic systems. We want to make sure there's no active permits with the EPA for discharge of any kind. I really didn't care what it was. If there was somebody was fixing cars in their backyard behind one of the swamps I wanted to use, I excluded it immediately. If there's livestock, excluded it. If there's horses, especially excluding that area. And a lot of that was ground truthing. You know, you can only get so much from satellite. I know I say that as somebody that just worked with NASA, but it is limited. You need to be boots on the ground, physically looking at your wetlands, making sure it's not mislabeled or mischaracterized, or that something hasn't changed drastically in 30 years since it was evaluated. I know it's in theory illegal for you to modify a wetland, but that does not stop farmers and everyday people. So you want to make sure that you go and determine if this is truly a persistent source of water. Especially in summer, it's a good time to do it, even if it's very hot. And ideally, if you can schedule it around a global pandemic, it's great. It gives you so much more time. It's ideal. So then we began our monthly sampling regime. I'm just giving you some context so you have an idea what this data is coming from. It involved monthly sampling. We followed EPA guidelines for everything that was pertinent to the EPA essentially, and we followed USGS field methods because we want to make sure that we were replicatable and precise. And so that leads to my first batch of results, which was the microbial analysis. Reminder that this is, we wanted to determine, can you even identify wild pigs as the source of fecal contamination in headwater experience? And the way that we decided we were going to go about it is with a thing called digital droplet PCR. And we were looking for Bacteroides, which is a type of bacteria found in the enteric system of most organisms, like most mammals especially. And we were going after pig 2 bat, or really in the weeds of it, but that's the specific swine marker that we were looking for. And by we, I mean not me, a lab, because like I just mentioned, this is a global pandemic. Do you know how hard it is to get pipettes and things in the global pandemic? Pretty difficult. So we worked with the lab to be able to get this done. And what we found was, yes, you absolutely can identify what, like pigs, as a source of fecal contamination. Reminder, there were no like pig houses, pork houses, anywhere in any of my wetlands. I made sure of it. I drove around, I knocked on doors, I asked local landowners, do you know of anybody that has pigs in their backyard around here? It's a weird question, but it helps if you're from the state you're studying in, because then they can trust you a little bit. And it also helps if you're wearing orange, not this orange, but it did help. And so we found it. And I think that there's an advantage to doing this, especially for the context of looking for recent contamination of a wetland or a water source, because in the Southeast, it's hot. And that makes the water perfect for pathogens, but it also degrades DNA. The average stream temp in my study was 17.4 degrees Celsius, and the summer stream temp range was 24 to 27. This was like warm water, which was really pleasant in summer and then less so in winter. But still, this is great. It means that when I would go out and sample, if it came back positive for this microbial analyses, then it was confirmation. Alternatively, this is a drawback. I just want to spoiler alert. If you're trying to do something that is and not able to get out on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, you're reducing your odds of positively identifying, which is why we also use field observations to double confirm what we were finding. If it just tested positive, we wanted to make sure that what we were looking at could be pig and not just a false negative. This include wallows, this include me being chased by pigs, this included carcasses on the back road that you're taking to get to the site. There's lots of clues that a pig has been there. Some of it's the rooting. They like to scratch their back and like sides on the lower portions of trees. And so there's all kinds of ways to do this, but we make sure that for every time we go in the field, we jot down any signs, evidence of pigs, included tracks and dead bodies and them chasing me and all those things I just mentioned. So verification is essential if you don't want to be ripped to shreds in like committee meetings where you're comps or whatever. So public health risk as well is going to be our next thing we're going to talk about. Once we've determined that you can link the E. coli in a stream to pigs specifically, and you can classify your systems as being with pigs or without pigs, the next thing to do is look at what's going on in it. And what we found at large, when we combined the entire data set and we looked at the whole study, there's about 19.7% greater median concentrations of E. coli in streams with pigs than without. And that sample number, I'm very proud of. So that's why I included it, because that's a hard thing to do across a whole study, especially a large scale one. Hurricanes, I had 3 at one study area repetitively in the span of like a year and a half. It was horrible. And so there's all these compounding effects. So you really want to make sure that you have like adequate sample size. There's also 4.7% greater median concentration of fecal coliforms. I'm less proud of this, and that's because I didn't anticipate how many dilutions I would have to do, because the sky is kind of the limit, it turned out, with fecal coliforms, especially in the summer in the south. I maxed out after 3 dilutions. So I did the best I could, but there's only so much budgeting that you can do to be able to get more than that. And the reason I'm kind of like mentioning these multi-regional impacts is because what we really found with this portion of the study is way more interesting, and especially the next slide we'll get to, which is the regional variability. Most of what you see with the multi-regional impacts has to do with vast differences in your regional variability. For example, there's 35.5% greater E. coli streams with wild pigs in the wiregrass, and that's in contrast to 1.4% greater. So we were seeing less of an influence. I've got theories about what this has to do with. It's really in the weeds. It involves biogeochemistry. If you didn't like organic chemistry, you're not going to like my explanation. It does involve the chemical arrangement of different types of clay. There's paper pending, but it's really interesting to me, and it's interesting for management. We'll get to it in a minute. But yeah, that's our public health risk, was that there was at scale across these two regions and all of those samples, a noticeable increase in E. coli and in streams with pigs versus without. So now this is my bread and butter. This is the thing that I'm most excited about and like to talk about the most, which is some of the physical chemical impacts, which involve. How do you go backwards? Misclick, sorry. I had 95.7% more nitrate in streams with pigs, 83.3% more magnesium in streams with pigs versus without, 95.7% greater potassium levels in streams with pigs versus without. Probably wondering why I would care about those three things, but those are three of the most essential nutrients for forest productivity. You do not have chlorophyll without magnesium. It's one of the building blocks of chlorophyll. Without nitrate, nitrogen rules the forest. The cycling of it alongside carbon is everything to do with the forest productivity. And potassium is also essential for a multitude of things, including stress tolerance, and growth rates and things like that. Cellular, excuse me, I'm sorry. That's the one responsible for wood growth as well. So, excuse me, I just wanted to double check so I wouldn't misspeak. So that's why that mattered a lot. I pulled those out specifically. I had other confounding information, and it would really depend on region, which we're about to get into. But the fact that this came back so cleanly, I've been informed, is rarity and water quality. So this means that it's really important to look at. Very rarely do you get like clean distinctions like this between something as nebulous as the counties and pigs without pigs. And as mentioned with the public health discussion, most of this had to do with extreme variability between the Gulf Coast and the Wiregrass. And we had 337% more nitrate in streams with wild pigs in the Gulf Coast region than we did without, 123.5% with magnesium, 261.5% for potassium. A little spoiler alert is that those are oligotrophic systems. They're really poor in nutrients to begin with. The actual numbers, if you look at the median concentrations, which you can find on the publication if you're interested in the weeds of this, is that the Wiregrass had higher levels overall for both streams, with or without pigs. But because the Gulf Coast is such a nutrient poor system, much like in South Carolina and North Carolina, where you have carnivorous plants, these are the types of swamps in Alabama where you have carnivorous plants. In fact, we have a really famous pitcher plant bog. It's huge, it's great. It's right up the road from a bunch of my study sites, which is alarming because you do not have those systems, entire ecosystems, without an absence of nutrients. And so if you're talking about something that is causing that great of an increase, there's going to be a tipping point. You can only push a system so far, especially as we continue to develop these systems, drain swamps, build more and more suburban residential environments. As long as people continue to pour billions of dollars into fertilizing grass, these systems are under pressure. And the idea that we have an invasive mammal that's coming in as well and simultaneously also increasing your nutrient levels is something for further study. We do need to look into that. And that was maybe one of the most exciting results for my PhD. It's one of the things that makes me so excited about the work I get to do here at Clemson now, which is managing the damage of wildlife. We know their impacts to crops, and it's horrific, and multi-billion-dollar losses every single year, year over year, and growing because the pig populations are growing, as mentioned, some of the most prolific mammals on Earth. And they're reproducing at the rate of bred swine, produced swine, not their Eurasian. So it's really important that we consider some of these pressures we're adding to our coastal systems, especially when you stop and consider that a lot of these systems, like the Gulf Coast region, is essential for us weathering hurricanes. From Katrina to Michael, all of the hurricanes in the last 20 years, basically, that have hit the panhandle of Florida, hit those systems. We've got saltwater inundation, all of these effects are hitting these forests year over year over year. And like I just mentioned, there is a tipping point. They can only be pushed so far. The resilience only goes so far. So that was extremely interesting results to find. However, interestingly enough as well, I didn't, delve as deep into it a second ago on the last slide, because I wanted to give you some context about the variability that we're finding. In the wiregrass, we produce way more livestock, although on paper they're the same, and when I selected watersheds, I ensured that broadly speaking, the counties had equivalent levels of ag production, and that included crops and cows. But the economies are different. The economy of the Gulf Coast relies a lot more on tourism and timber, whereas Wiregrass relies more on its ag. So their concerns, what worries them, is threats to their livestock. And what I found there was that alongside these seemingly negligible increases to nitrate, magnesium, and potassium, these systems had enough of an increase in their E. coli that it was more pressing of a concern for public health in the Wiregrass than it was in the Gulf Coast. So two things can be true, and it really depends on your management needs. What are the damages for an individual region? Is it something, do we need to be worried about just fencing them out of a wetland? Or do we need to exterminate them? In the Gulf Coast, I would say kill every pig you see, and quickly. There's gopher tortoises there, there's eastern indigo snakes, there's pine bearing tree frogs, there's all of these really vulnerable populations, and these pigs don't care. They're opportunistic omnivores, they will eat everyone that they come across. It's a real issue. Salamanders, terrifying. The idea of these pigs getting into some of our more vulnerable salamander habitat, most of which is in the highlighted Gulf Coast counties or adjacently. So if you're in those counties, I'd say kill every pig, not for public safety, but for the safety of the ecosystem. In the Wiregrass, do not let your dog and your kid swim in the creeks. I grew up swimming in the creeks. In fact, the summer before I did this research, I was spending a lot of time post-undergrad floating down various creeks with my friends, which in retrospect, I've got some mixed feelings about. But, you know, fence out your livestock, keep them out of the waterways. This was a big thing I keep saying over and over again, but it's really important because we don't have like water troughs in the Wiregrass. Why would we? I mean, there's a pond, a creek in every pasture. Nobody excludes their pigs. And I went and confirmed that. I made a trip down from Auburn specifically to go to a place called the Cowboy Church. It's also simultaneously like the headquarters of the Southeastern Cattlemen's Association. And I asked around, I was like, y'all fence out of your creeks? And they're like, you're a really weird Auburn student, but no. So, I'll answer your questions, especially if you sit through church with them. So yeah, those are my PhD findings. And I say that loosely because I have a million more chapters and a bunch of other interesting papers that came out of it. But this is what I was originally hired to do. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Is there any questions before I go on to the next part of my talk? Okay. Well, I probably should have stayed on that side, but it won't. The reason I'm here today is because I'm now leading the wildlife damage management program here at Clemson. It's an extension program, and really lucky to have this because wildlife is our menaces in South Carolina, it turns out. Mainly to farmers, but as previously mentioned, we need to look into all these other potential impacts as well. But 69% of South Carolina farmers report significant wildlife damage. Wild pigs represent about $150 million in damages in South Carolina every year. White-tailed deer is shocking to some people, not shocking to me, because they're everywhere. But $172 per acre in soybean producers, $243 per acre to cotton producers, $188 per acre to peanut producers. For context, I just visited the site of a farmer. He farms out 4,000 acres, not all of which he owns. And he got to show me some soybean fields of his. And you could see where he owns the land or has rights to hunt it versus a site where he's not allowed to hunt the deer. And by hunt, I mean file with the state for depredation permits to remove significant numbers off of the landscape. Because what I observed is that despite being planted within a week of each other, despite having the exact same conditions, because they're quite literally down the same stretches of roads as each other, the area where he did not have permits to kill deer, it's half the size. And it required a lot of spraying of herbicides, which are bitter to the taste of deer, and therefore they will like avoid them for a few weeks until most of it's been washed off. And he had to apply all of that to all of his fields. And it just was enough to get it above that like really critical growing stage, but not enough to help the yield. What actually helps is when you killed it, and a lot of them every year. And having the property permissions to be able to do that. And so that's kind of why we brought here to Clemson. It's because we need to have programs for doing outreach to hunters to bring them into the conversation. We need to be able to educate our students and basically inform the next generation of natural resource professionals that as exciting as some of the theoretical knowledge we learn is, everything when it ties back to an objective, it's a lot stronger. Your research is just better because it's applicable to people and they care. And I say better in terms of addressing the problems of today that are most critically felt. This is not a qualitative statement. I love herpetology, but what really farmers, as much as they like conservation, they really have to be able to afford to make it to the next year. And so these are really pressing issues. And if you like conservation, then you like suburbs not being built on wetlands. You like suburbs not being built in the middle of what used to be an ag field. And you're not going to have that if the farmers can't pay their bills. So these conservation and managing and like supporting farmers go hand in hand. So we're going to put together a Center for Human Wildlife Conflict. This is just to help facilitate research with extension, help you get in contact with landowners. For example, Dr. Dukowski has a student doing some beaver research. It's really neat. Helping send her information of people that we know that are experiencing a lot of beaver damage because they don't call you, they call extension and complain about beavers and look for solutions. And so this is one of the real benefits of being located here at Capitals. And of course, creative inquiries and things like that, all the different ways to get students involved with applied management, applied conservation through. We'll also be doing educational programs like I just mentioned about the hunters. We have to reach people where they're at. We need to bring them to the table, help them understand the importance of their involvement, help them understand it's better for the deer, it's better for the farmers, it's better for us all. And especially if you like the rarity that South Carolina has, which is 3 bucks to 2 does. It's like the tags you're given. In Alabama, I think people would be going bananas if that was proposed. They would be so excited if that was the policy. And so if they want to, if South Carolinians want to keep it that way, it's really important that we start to address some of the deer damage in the state so that we can continue to have the hunting as it currently exists. And also, who wants to kill like a Fort Worth deer? Have y'all been out there? They're tiny. They're like little barrier island deer. It's smaller than my dog. And while yes, she's a really large German Shepherd, it's embarrassing to know, you know? And then, of course, like citizen outreach, that kind of thing. Educational components are multifaceted. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, the ways that we intend to approach it, unless you're interested, in which case, call me. We have internship opportunities and stuff like that. And then collaborative partnerships. Nothing in wildlife will ever be done without partnerships. And if the Alabama Feral Swine Eradication and Control Pilot Program, which is now just the program at large, is any indication, no problem to be addressed solo. You'll need the help of the USDA, multiple branches, Wildlife Services, NRCS, various task force, things like that. It really is beneficial when you have a lot of different partners at the table because they have different contacts and they also understand different needs. So yeah. That's my talk for today. Thank you for being patient with me and my excitement. I definitely bumbled over quite a bit in my eagerness to tell you all about my water quality, but it was quite a privilege to get to talk to you today.
I do not know really anything about hunting, but I agree, like everything you talked about, it sounds, working with different communities and working with people with different skills and backgrounds, it's really important to bring them into these kind of conversations. And when you started with just the hogs, I was like, man, what do you do with a dead hog? And then you started talking about deer and I was like, well, people, you know, hunt deer very frequently, like people probably sometimes also consume them. Like, what do you do with all the animals that you remove from the ecosystem through death?
Personally, I live on my family farm when I go out and kill a sounder, which because we apply constant pressure, I don't have pigs in my home county, which is fun because I was right down the road from my family farm where people had a ton of pigs. And I had game cameras set up the entirety of my program, or project to make sure that we didn't have any pigs on our property. And we had one, and it was the January before, I started my work with pigs. And the reason behind that is we apply constant pressure. So that's another advocacy for doing whole sounder removal. Ultimately, I like to give the nutrients back to the land. You know, they're out there, they're consuming like turkey and tons of starches and carbohydrates, basically anything to get their mouth on. And I personally like to let the nutrients go back into that system. If you have access to heavy machinery, you can dig a hole so you don't have to like deal with the pig carcass around. Sometimes it can be beneficial to leave them on the surface because occasionally it will draw other pigs into the area as they come in to eat everyone, which is a terrible way to spread disease, but great if you're trying to kill more pigs. Because then you can just take their dead friend, put them in the middle of a trap alongside some corn, and then you'll get more. I don't know, that's one of my favorite ways of business. I don't know if it's the best thing to be advertising, but that's a really good use for it. The most part though, do not transport a carcass, especially pigs, because of how many diseases they can carry. I can't urge you enough. Not only is it illegal in a lot of different communities for you to transport them, and I mean like on a federal level, not state. So transporting carcasses is a big no-no, especially in a time of African swine fever, which is thankfully not here yet, even though it would be very convenient because it would kill all of our pigs. It would also destroy the pork industry and those farmers would never recover. Because essentially you no longer export meat. But anyway, don't move carcasses, leave them. I know it's annoying for landowners. I tell them this all the time. I have the utmost empathy for them. It stinks. It brings in a lot of other animals. A lot of farmers are very alarmed by the presence of coyotes. I recommend if you've killed a pig and you've left it in your back pasture, maybe don't let your little terrier out in the backyard unattended for a while, because there might be a coyote being drawn into the area. Toddlers, same thing good for them. Anything true of your dog, probably true for toddlers. Don't leave them in the backyard unattended. And I'm only kind of joking because when I was in Barcelona, I got to learn about how boars and sows routinely knock children off of their bicycles to steal their lunch bags, which on a personal note, I think would be a really fun story. But on the other hand, they are very concerned about it because sometimes kids do get hurt a little bit. They're large mammals.
That's interesting that you said, you know, you could also bury them. I was just wondering, because you mentioned the risk of like diseases, obviously, and that being a vector for all that. What is the concern with like, you have to leave it to like decompose? Have you like, or are you interested in looking at how like the decomposing act of the pig could spread diseases, or does nature kind of take care of that over time in the decomposition process?
I think it depends on the disease you're concerned about.
Okay.
Something like if the pig had brucellosis, for example, the odds are that the brucellosis is already in all the populations around it. It would be very weird to have it isolated. These are very social creatures. It's why some people have empathy for them. Notice it's some people, who doesn't include me, but they're very social. So they're spreading disease amongst themselves. They will move throughout their home range. There's some examples of territoriality. There's other examples of not. Even if there is, they quickly fill any vacant opening, as was seen with that first study showed. So I don't worry about it as much unless you're thinking about something like African swine fever, something of like really extreme economic impact or public health impact. If they had been a primary vector of COVID, for example, that would have been a huge risk. Obviously they weren't, but yeah, just an example. Yeah.
So like with how like sometimes when you hunt deer, you can have venison. You ever heard of anyone eating wild pig, or is it highly not recommended?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, really? okay,
Yeah,
okay.
no, that's in theory, that's why they were brought here by the conquistadors.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
of course.
So like you can
And
still eat the ones that are around today.
my recommendation is somebody who has learned maybe too much about pigs is never eat undercooked pork. Just in any capacity, whether that's farmed or wild, just don't do that. I will say piglets, really, really low disease risk, very good meat. Young sows before they've had their first litter essentially, they're delicious and low disease risk. It's when you get into the older ones that they're more gamey, tougher, and higher disease risk.
That is super interesting.
And be
Thank
careful
you.
with organ meat. And that southern thing of putting blood on your face, I'm as southern as anybody, don't do that. That's unnecessary risk, you're gonna get some kind of parasite in your eye, just don't. It's really unnecessary.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome.
You mentioned that you guys did some like ground truthing when you were testing for like the pig two-back, the marker for the E. coli. Did you have any sites where you had like found sign of pigs or the wallows or on a camera or whatever, but then didn't have like high enough levels to find the microbe you were looking at in the water sources?
Yes. This is why it's really important. This is one of those limitations of the swine tobacco is how rapidly it can degrade. Essentially, when I was done and I was putting in my data and really looking for anomalies like that, mostly what was happened was a farmer got tired of the premise of my project and went in because a little backstory is that I was supposed to be monitoring pre, during, and post of some federal removal. This is just the starting portion of the project. And some farmers got tired of waiting and went out and killed a bunch of sounders. And then luckily they didn't have the density in that watershed for them to come back in. I didn't view it as a problem because if you're not testing positive for markers and I don't see any fresh sign of pigs, no recent tracks, no recent rubs. I never found feces directly. Sometimes you could definitely smell that this was a piggy spot. But aside from that, what we found over time was that those were probably a transient population that we had just kind of stumbled across on our first ground truthing exercise. But then that just served in our control, as our without pigs. Because if you're never detecting anything in the water, you're doing this for years, month after month, in all weather conditions, including literally hours before hurricane hit. Really good data. Never leave it on the table if you can physically get to your site and get it for the hurricane hits. But yeah.
Thank you.
So I've always heard about wild pigs is they're like very dangerous to people. And you mentioned you got chased by pigs a lot. So like, how did you mitigate that since you're working so closely with them?
I'm the #1 advocate for grad students not going out alone. It seems convenient. It seems like you're under all this pressure. You think your PI will never forgive you, in which case, okay. The reality is that a grad student died while I was at Auburn. He went out to a farm by himself in bad weather and was assisting a farmer with the repair of a fish pond and was electrocuted and died. And I'm not saying that it could have been avoided by having multiple hands, but we were told that if he had been able to deal with the issue outside of the water, which he would have been able to do if he had more hands available, it might not have happened. And so that's one example. I have a great story courtesy of Stephen Madeir, who is one of my favorite co-authors. He's the best research associate I've ever met. And I would hire him in a heartbeat if I could convince him to move up here, because he's phenomenal. But he told me a great story about his buddy. And this is the thing you'll find with people from Louisiana. They always have a great story about their buddy. But they were out and they were killing pigs and they got charged that essentially there was a mishap with a trap and they got loose. And at that point, they were very riled up, full of adrenaline, very angry. And they were shooting them at most of the guys were able to get up a tree. One of the guys was not quite fast enough to get up a tree. And when he looked down after all the pigs were dead, hit the top of his calf muscle was hanging over his snake boots. Oh. And that's just from a grazing blow from the cutting tooth of one of the pigs. So this wasn't a giant boar that did it, just a sow. And they're large animals with a lot of force behind them. You gotta think they're adapted for turning over soil. So they've got strong necks Everybody's seen that Smoky, like not everybody, but you should look it up if you haven't, it's great. But there's a video out of the Great Smoky Mountains where a black bear is killing a pig. And it's a great example of how these animals can continue to get up and charge despite a fatal wound having been delivered. So that's one of the risks. Had the misfortune of the one time we were actually in danger. I was up to my knees in a really tiny creek that we had to be bent over like this because there's all kinds of invasive vegetation. So one of the 2 times I went to the field with somebody that wasn't a research associate affiliated with the project, so it was one of my buddies, which is a really fortunate situation. And we started hearing clicking. It's a thing a sow does. If you're in the experimental forest and you hear clicking and then you see little piglets go by, run, just get out of there. She's very mad at you and she's letting you know. It's the thing they do under high stress, where they kind of clap their teeth together. So that was the one that I think of most fondly, because it was also, because I had somebody that was just a friend from up north. I didn't bring my gun that day. So I was on the truck bed for a while. Just kind of waiting for her to leave so I could go and get my several $1,000 equipment out of the creek that I just abandoned it in. They are dangerous. Don't leave them alone. Question?
How does the pig or the wild pig defend itself? Does it have self-defense in other states like Alabama, for example, against this big black bear? If the big black bear is going to eat this wild pig, so does it have to protect or defend itself? It's kind of protection such as it's kind of protect itself. I mean, that was my question.
They run. Most bears aren't attacking them. Why would you if you get into somebody's trash? I mean, like most of our bear populations are unfortunately co-located with humans in the Southeast. In Alabama, we have 2 main populations. There's one around this is meaningless without a map, but it's around the Mobile, Tennessee Delta. And we have them up in the northeastern portion of the state. The northeastern portion of the state, you're going to experience similar things in Great Smoky Mountains because the Appalachians don't end in Georgia, despite what they want to tell people. They end in Alabama. And so we still have like Appalachian dynamics and things like that. So that's where bears are. They are connected to populations in Tennessee and Georgia. Our population down in the southwestern portion of the state are more isolated. Those bears are very elusive. They're really risk adverse. It's hard to track them. It's hard to find them. If they're encountering pigs, they're probably running from them just based off of the behavior that we see with humans and basically anything else. There's so much easier food sources because Alabama's, should have mentioned this earlier, it's one of my favorite facts. It's one of the most biodiverse states in the country. California, we have more freshwater fish in one of our rivers than the entire state of California. It's really amazing. And so in terms of forage for the pigs and the bears, it's really abundant. So they're not going to get into a high risk conflict, generally speaking, unless it's necessary.
Do they bite back? Do they protect? For example, I was giving the bear as an example, but against any other creature, any other aggressive creature. So does it have? So does this pig can bite back or attack?
Yeah, they'd love to bite me if they could get food. My shins are really conveniently located for them. They're really large too, so broad shoulders, heavy. Their force, like their center of gravity, is really tight. That's why they're such formidable animals to have on the landscape invasively, because they are quite hardy. And like that video that I recommended, you'll see a lot of different defense mechanisms in that. It involves like charging, hitting them physically, biting, trying to get them with their like cutting teeth, as they're called.
And do they hunt? Do they hunt for food or they eat food? Do they have ways of hunting? For example, any other small creatures? These pigs?
Yeah, and large. Yeah, so they'll rip a fawn apart. There's some like really interesting game camera images of that if you want to see how they predate deer. Do they do it in enough numbers to be useful? No, unfortunately. But anything that they can get their mouth on, they'll just eat. They've got great crushing force. They're able to just consume it. I don't know if that answers, they're just opportunistic, so they're not hunting per se. They just, as they come across an opportunity to consume something with high nutrient reward, they're just going to consume it. And alarmingly, as is evidenced by that study with the toads, it appears that when they stumble across a buffet, they take advantage of that and will eat as many as they can in that one spot until they're gone.
Great. Well, let's thank Elizabeth one more time. For those of you who signed up for lunch, it'll be in this room in a few minutes. So feel free to come up and ask any more questions you have for me, Elizabeth, versus and then move on to that.
I told people that that happened.
Oh, yeah.
Eat that day.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah, people like. Yeah. That was. Yeah, shit. All these. Come on. I have large stuff on the. It's like.
I remember